All right, welcome back. Fields of Glory, football in World War II. So please don't tell us the score. I think we know it. This section explores how America's favorite game, football, for those who don't know that, endured and evolved during one of history's darkest periods. And Brad Pearson will tell us the inspiring story of Japanese-American players who formed a powerhouse football team inside a World War II incarceration camp. Randy Roberts will highlight the legendary matchups, that's code for the Army-Navy games, that lifted national morale and reflected the spirit of the country at war. And I have to confess, Dr. Con Crane had argued for this session for years. I don't know how we managed to have it at the same time as an Army football game going on TV. I messed that up, but Con has had a distinguished career, 26 years in the Army, to include 9 years as a professor of history at West Point. 32 years ago, Major Crane was my boss. That dates us a little bit. But he went on to have a distinguished career at the Army War College, Military History Institute, Strategic Studies Institute, really culminating in 2016, the Society for Military History named Con as the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize winner for his lifetime contributions to the field of military history. So I can't think of anybody better than that. A friend of the museum, presidential counselor, mentor, to turn this session over. So Dr. Con Crane.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. Always appreciate that. I always get some very unusual panels. I've actually been at every conference all of the 18 conferences, and I seem to get some of the more unusual and unique opportunities. And then this is another one. This is a really interesting session. A few years ago, Sports Illustrated did a survey of the most iconic American sports sites. Number 1 was Yankee Stadium. Number 2 was Churchill Downs. And number 3 was Michie Stadium at West Point. If you've ever been there, when you're in the stadium, if you look in the south end zone, on the wall there, it has the name of the 3 Heisman Trophy winners, Blanchard, Davis, and Pete Dawkins. And also has their 5 national championship teams, 1914, 1916, 1944, 45, and 46. So one aspect of this panel is going to be talking about some of those great Army teams and some of their Navy competitors and competition during the war. The other extreme, we're going to talk about something different. We're talking about the Japanese Americans, the internment camps, who also achieved excellence in football. Their goal was a little bit different. They were trying to display a superiority in an American sport as part of their campaign, really to prove that they belonged in the larger society. It's actually pretty advantageous. If you look at the program, the 2 speakers for the panel are right across from each other. So you only have to turn to one page to read the good details. Brad Pearson, he calls himself a journalist, but his stuff is a lot deeper, really, if you read his material. He's going to talk today about his book, The Eagles of Heart Mountain, which was the basis for an Emmy-nominated NFL documentary, which was called 9066, which was the number of the order that interned the Japanese Americans. Fear Football and the Theft of Freedom. It's really a significant analysis of the ways that these Japanese Americans dealt with the tough situation they were in a very, very American way with football. Our other panelist, Randy Roberts, is the Distinguished Professor of History and 150th Anniversary Professor at Purdue University. He's written 30-some books on all kinds of topics. He's won all kinds of teaching awards, National Book Awards, been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, there's so many things that he has done. And today he's going to focus on, again, the unique Army-Navy competition during the war, and how that reflected American values, what it meant, And again, hopefully, a lot of emphasis on those great Army teams of 44, 45, and 46. Gentlemen, Brad, you first.
Thank you for the kind introduction and for welcoming me. Are we on now? Okay, cool. Thanks for the kind introduction and for welcoming me here to this conference. It's my first time, and it's really wonderful and just to see everybody and all of their different expertises. So I actually want to start, before we get to the team at the center of my book, I want to talk about the place Hart Mountain here. It's a peculiar looking mountain, one of the foremost geological mysteries on Earth. The rock on the top of the mountain is 300 million years older than the rock at the bottom of the mountain. And this is something that has puzzled geologists throughout the field. And they've settled on this theory, in that 48 million years ago in southern Montana, a 500 square mile chunk of dolomite and limestone broke away from the Earth and traveled at 100 miles an hour to this spot in northwest Wyoming where it sits today. It's the largest surface landslide in the history of the planet. And how that happened is still up for debate, but the working theory is that some sort of volcanic or steam explosion occurred, carrying this chunk of rock to its final resting place. And then, for millions of years, the land sat uninhabited. Native tribes passed through, as did fur trappers and early settlers, driven away by the mountain lions and the harsh climate. It gets down to -30 in the winter and the hottest part of Wyoming in the summer. After the decades, small towns of Cody and Powell popped up in the nearby Bighorn Basin, but the land surrounding Hart Mountain was empty until the US government decided to remove 120,000 people of Japanese descent from the West Coast. The event we all think of as kicking off mass incarceration, Pearl Harbor, was really just the final step in a decades-long fight to remove Japanese and Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Groups like, on this slide, you'll see the Native Sons of the Golden West and the American Legion were staunch advocates for the removal of Japanese Americans decades before Pearl Harbor, and teamed up with ranchers and politicians of all parties to pass racist land laws, immigration quotas, and housing discrimination. The reason was farming. Japanese farmers had begun to dominate the West Coast. They started as laborers, but eventually grew into kings in some corners of the agricultural world. For instance, by as early as 1910, Japanese farmers produced 70% of California's strawberries. And at the dawn of America's entry into World War II, in 1941, Japanese American farmers controlled 2 out of every 3 acres of vegetable farms in Los Angeles County, and every single planted acre of peas, broccoli, beets, celery, and cauliflower. So when Pearl Harbor happens, all of these groups sort of snap into action and see the war as an excuse to execute a plan they'd hoped to hatch literally for decades. And in just a matter of weeks, these ideas that sort of started in farms and in small towns trickled their way up from the farms and councils of California to the War Department and to 2 men, John DeWitt and Carl Benditson. These 2 men eventually build an argument that allows the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast for, quote, military necessity, but in reality is just the fulfillment of these decades of racism. Benditson, DeWitt, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt go so far as ignoring the country's own intelligence reports from the Navy, the FBI, and other groups. The United States had spies in the Japanese community for years, in California, Hawaii, Washington, and every report came back with the same information. There was little risk of espionage or sabotage from the Japanese community. They were loyal Americans. And that was proven by the end of the war. No Japanese American was ever convicted of a crime against the United States during World War II, something that can't be said for the Germans or Italian Americans who were not incarcerated in great numbers during the war. Now, this part of the book, when I was writing it, the part about FDR and the history leading up to the camps, sort of has a special place in my heart in that I grew up in Hyde Park, New York. I went to Franklin Delano Roosevelt High School. We were, I think, probably the only high school in America whose team mascot was the Presidents. It doesn't necessarily strike fear into your opponents when you're like, we're really good with executive orders. But growing up in a place like Hyde Park, you get sort of steeped in the lore of Roosevelt. My middle school was built with New Deal funds, and Roosevelt himself approved the plans while he was in the White House for the middle school. So for me, learning about this other part of Roosevelt was sort of a corrective to my upbringing. And, not to be too critical of Roosevelt, but for me, this is really a black spot on his record when I think he did and so many tremendous things for this country. And so this point, 20 years after I'd left high school to be researching all of this was sort of an interesting career track that I didn't think I'd ever have. So this executive order that Roosevelt signs, 9066, eventually leads to the creation of Heart Mountain, one of 10 War Relocation Authority camps across Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. 11,000 people were at Heart Mountain, living in barracks that had each been built in less than an hour. They were the first people to ever live on that land, likely in human history. They were stripped of almost everything, but everything, especially Japanese: music, reading materials, even heirlooms. They were each allowed to bring one suitcase into the camp. Overnight, the camp became the third largest city in the state of Wyoming. And one of the very first things the adults did when they arrived at camp was to clear land for a baseball field. There was virtually nothing to do, and in order to try and regain some semblance of normal life, they started playing sports. Which leads me to the protagonists of my story. The Eagles of Heart Mountain is the true story of the best high school football team in the history of the state of Wyoming, a group of incarcerated Japanese American teenagers during World War II. As I began researching this team, I learned that not only were these kids playing and winning games, but they were doing it with 4,000 or 5,000 fans lining the field, more people than had ever been gathered on that spot in human history. Because the thing is, when you're being held against your will in a camp, there's not really that many things to do. And for me, it was, when you're writing a book, you not only want interesting characters, but you want impactful characters. And from the very first game, I knew that one of my main characters was going to be a young man named Babe Nomura. He's here up in the upper left. Before being taken from his home and sent to camp, Babe was the starting running back for Hollywood High School in Los Angeles. He was a multi-sport star, starting at second base as well as on the track team. At the time, Japanese Americans weren't welcomed into white leagues, so they started their own athletic leagues. Babe dominated these: basketball, softball, track, and eventually competed against and beat players in their 20s and 30s. He was quick, with great hands and incredible instincts. He was, in my eyes and the community's eyes, the best Japanese American athlete of his generation anywhere in the United States. After he left Heart Mountain, he went on to play football at San Jose State and was offered tryouts by both the NFL and Major League Baseball. So when he gets to Heart Mountain, he tries out for the football team, which a gym teacher had just started. It turns out only 3 players of the 41 to try it out had ever played football before. The rest were all just athletes: shortstops, track and field stars, point guards. They all had to learn the rules of football, and they had to learn them quickly. The first game was in only 13 days. But soon, they started crushing their opponents, 48-0, 60-0, and that's all because they turned their weaknesses into strengths. All the teams that the Heart Mountain Eagles faced were all white teams from across the farmlands of Wyoming and Montana. In some games, the Eagles were outweighed by 40 pounds a player. Japanese Americans at the time, because of their low dairy and high vegetable diets, were much smaller than the average American. The center for the Eagles team weighed just 120 pounds, which is just unfathomable now, that a center would be close to 2 to 3 times that size if you were to find an NFL lineman. So they knew they couldn't outmuscle their opponents, but they'd have to outwork them. So instead of running the ball, which was the common at the time, they threw it, using multiple wide receivers to spread out the defense and counterbalance their size advantage. They created a sort of proto-West Coast offense years before it became popular. And their opponents had never seen anything like it before. It was created by, their coach at the time was a man named Tubby Kawasaki, who got his nickname because he was 5'6" and 200 pounds. But he was a coach before the war. He was a coach at Los Angeles City College, and he had sort of experimented with this idea of, it seems kind of quaint, naive now, but of throwing the football. And he sort of said, well, all of us are smaller. Let's try to figure this out, and we'll throw it a little bit more. And at the same time, all of these players played both offense and defense. And since the Eagles were thinner and in better shape, they simply ran other teams ragged. They took what should have been a major disadvantage and turned it into a winning formula. And I think there's probably a good lesson in there for all of us, whether on or off the field. To this day, the Eagles have the highest win percentage of any team in Wyoming State football history. Now this right here, when I was doing my research for the book, I spent a lot of time in Wyoming, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and I was spending time with Babe Nomura's daughter one day, and we were flipping through family heirlooms from the camp and photos, and I came across this. And anyone who has ever played high school sports knows how important a varsity letter is. And for me, this heirloom and this piece of history, this artifact, just really shows how important this team was to the people of Heart Mountain. You see, at Heart Mountain, they had very little money, resources. The players didn't have pads. They had cardboard shoved into their pants. But the community came together and raised money so that everybody that played on the football team would get a varsity letter. And I think that that just shows how important this team was, not only to themselves and other sports fans, but everybody else at the camp in terms of what this team meant for morale. That they had no money, but they could still save up to get these kids varsity letters. So I want to talk for a second about this photo, which I kept on my desktop the whole time I was writing this book. When I got this book deal, I realized I had an opportunity to bring the story of Japanese American incarceration to a much broader audience. There are lots of books on the topic, but most of them are either memoirs or academic texts, both of which are incredibly helpful and built the foundation of what I wrote. But there are very few nonfiction narratives about this history, books who trace characters' lives from the years before, during, and after the camps. And I realized very quickly that there's a universality to this story. Like, if you look around the room right now, every single one of us has been a teenager. We know what being a teenager is like, and whether that's being a teenager here or in Germany or in an incarceration camp, there's certain things that are inevitable about being a teenager. So when I was telling the story through the actions of Babe and his teammates, their decision-making, those are all things that we've experienced too. You know, what would it be like to be pulled from your friends, from your high school, to have your loyalty questioned? When these young men were in camp, they were presented with the ultimate question: would you die for your country? You see, while the United States government thought Japanese Americans were too dangerous to live on the West Coast, it also began drafting them into the armed forces. So members of the Eagles were forced to make a decision: join the Army or resist the draft and risk going to jail. It was a question of conflicting loyalties: loyalty to your country, loyalty to your people, loyalty to your family, and loyalty to your own principles. Eventually, 60 young men from Heart Mountain resisted the draft, leading to the largest mass trial in Wyoming state history. They were jailed for their resistance. Back to this photo, even after I wrote about this book, even after I wrote the book, I thought about this photo a lot. And I think about it because, you know, if you just sort of stick your thumb over the faces of the young men and women in this photo, these could be any teenagers from the 1940s. Their hair, their style of clothes, kids going to school, but they've been taken away from their homes and sent to camps just because the home country of their parents or grandparents. And I think about how, for all its good, the United States remains precarious, and how right now we can never let this happen again. And it's up to us to make sure it doesn't. Thank you.
Hello. I'd also like to thank you, Conrad and Nick and Connie and Jeremy and all the people who have been so kind to us as we prepared to come and talk here. I'm going to talk about Army football. I wrote a book called A Team for America. And the origins of books I find kind of interesting. This book came because I teach a course on World War II at Purdue University. I've been teaching it for a number of years. And I noticed that one time, that in 1944, Army won the national championship. And I thought, wow, there's got to be a story in there somehow. Here we have America's fighting in the season of 1944 between D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. And as the American Army is moving across the landscape, the football team is winning game after game after game. So I thought, you know, there must be a story in here. And as I started to do the book, I found there was kind of an interesting story to tell. And that's the story. Let me start by talking about one of the most important letters dealing with sports during World War II. And this is FDR. Another letter from FDR, a better letter though, I think, from FDR. The green light letter. What happened? What happened is shortly after Pearl Harbor, Commissioner of Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, wrote a letter to FDR and said, hey, what are we going to do about baseball during World War II? Should we cancel baseball? I mean, this is an unprecedented war. Sports seem to be the toy store of American landscape. Should we cancel it? And FDR wrote back and said, no, we should not cancel baseball. Baseball is an American institution. The workers will want to go to games. True, the great players are going to be drafted, they're going to be in the military, but you can have other players play in the games and you can keep the competition. He requested that more games were played at night, but otherwise, he says, keep playing the game. So this green light letter, as it's known, becomes the word for sports. Keep the sports going. Professional football, keep professional football going. Although there weren't many teams to play, some teams had to combine two teams into one team. For example, Pittsburgh combined 1 year with the Eagles and became what? Does anybody know? The Steagles, absolutely right. And they combined another year with Cardinals, and they became what? The Pit Cards. Hey, there's a war going on. We can't expect perfection, okay? They were bad under any name. Oh, Conrad, I'm so sorry about Army. Anyway. So what do we have here? I'm looking for somebody else to change it. Let's shift back now in time before Pearl Harbor. In 1940, Robert L. Eichelberger was promoted to brigadier general. Same class that Patton was promoted to brigadier general. Patton wrote Eichelberger saying, hey, they finally had enough good sense to promote us to general. Anyway, he was also promoted to a superintendent of the academy, or he was appointed superintendent of the academy. And he was a great football fan. And on the way to the academy, he stopped off to watch the Army football team play against Penn in Franklin Stadium. That's in your neck of the woods, isn't it? In Philadelphia. And Penn, how do I say this? Obliterated West Point. It was terrible. West Point was defeated 48-0 by Penn, capping a dismal season. 1 win, 7 losses, and I think 1 tie. The one team they beat 20-19 was Williams. Williams is a very fine institution of education, but it is not a football power. My wife and I attended a Williams game, and if Margie can correct me if I'm wrong, the marching band had someplace between 5 and 7 people in the marching band, and that was more than was in the stadium to watch the game. They were not a football power then. They're not a football power now. And I dare to say they will never be a football power. So if you're one victory that you're claiming, it's not over Navy, it's not over Notre Dame, it's not over Penn, all great teams during that years, it's over Williams. It's bad. Eichelberger continued from this game to the academy, and in his first meeting at the academy, we have it from the notes, he brought up football. Something's got to be done about Army football. This is pathetic. Look, folks, we're going to be going to war pretty soon. Remember, this is November 1940. The Battle of France has completed. The Battle of Britain is basically over. America can see a route to this war. And the Army, Eichelberger said, cannot be represented by a ragtag football team that brings nothing but disgrace on. We have got to do something about football. And West Point was in a difficult situation at this time. We have a new, not new, but we have a new commander of the Army, George Marshall, who's not a West Point graduate, he's a VMI graduate. And he's not sure West Point is the best place to train officers for the upcoming war. Where do we see West Point in the news? We see horseback riding, okay? In an age of tanks, the Army's still learning to ride horsebacks. We see, let's see here, what other things do we see? When you see pictures of the cadets, they're in Life magazine or the New York Times. They're always accompanying some debutante to a cotillion. This is the troops. There's a school solution for every problem. It lacks innovation. It lacks vitality. It lacks je ne sais quoi. I just need to throw some French in there every once in a while. A certain something, yeah. It hasn't changed. Anyway, so Eichelberger says, we have got to build a football team that America is proud of. And he decides what we're going to do is something radical at West Point. And that word radical is not in the vocabulary of most West Point leaders. What we're going to do is we're going to change the way football coaches are picked. There was football coaches before this time at West Point were active duty coaches. That is to say, they were in the military. They were probably played at West Point, maybe assistant coaches at West Point, but they were assigned as a tour of duty as coach. And Eichelberger said, no, this can't be. Okay, we need professional coaches. And he had one person in mind, and that's Red Blake, in the middle of these two other giants that I'll talk about later. Red Blake had been a coach, a very successful coach at Dartmouth. This is a time where Ivy League schools were still national powers, okay? So we have to put ourselves back in time. He wants Red Blake to come in. And Red Blake entertains the offer, but he says, look, we've got to have some institutional changes. For example, there were height and weight requirements at West Point. If you were 6 foot, you could not weigh, you had to weigh between 160 and 176 pounds. Having a couple, it may have worked on the West Coast, okay, but having a couple halfbacks that are 160, 65 pounds isn't going to scare Notre Dame very much. And the tallest you could be is 6'4", and you couldn't weigh more than 198 pounds. 6'4", you should be at least 230, okay? But no, 98. So Blake was able to get to communicate this to Eichelberger to the Congress. There were changes made so he could have a good team. Okay, so the next thing to do is, the question is, are we going to continue college football? We're given a green light, but many people think that the Army should be training soldiers and training officers and not playing football. Fortunately, one of the people who opposed playing football at all in colleges was Gene Tunney. Does anybody remember Gene Tunney in here? Boxer, right? Heavyweight champion of the world, defeated Jack Dempsey in a great long count fight, in another fight. Anyway, Tunney, who's the director of physical fitness for the Navy, doesn't want the cadets training to be officers to play football. He says it's too much time. Football, he says, is a waste. You can't become an officer. You can't train for the Army playing football. It just simply can't be done. Well, that's one opinion. Another opinion was a former coach at Navy, was a guy by the name of Thomas Hamilton. And you can see up behind me, there's Thomas Hamilton up here. Hamilton believed that no, playing football, playing competitive sports was fantastic training for officers. It's not sportsmanship, but competition was going to be essential to winning battles. You're going to have to compete. And so this is his approach. And he is able to institute this at naval training grounds. The idea is the military needs to train junior officers. We're going to need a lot of junior officers to fight World War II. The Navy developed, under Hamilton, a program called the V programs. First there was V5, there was pre-flight, but then there was a V12 programs that trained all or most of naval officers at different campuses in the United States. Purdue, Ohio State. Well, I don't think there was one at Ohio State. But over the nation, there were about 160 or 70 different colleges that had V12 programs. And so they could bring athletes to their programs. The Army decided their program was the Army Specialized Training Program. They didn't allow their trainees to play varsity sports. The Navy allowed the trainees to play varsity sports. Okay, so the key for football, for most colleges in World War II, is to have a Navy V12, preferably a Marine V12 program on campus. That means you could bring in athletes from other schools. This is before the portal. You could bring in athletes from other schools and they could play for your team. For example, why do I choose this example? Purdue, 1943. In 1943, Purdue returned one player from the 1942 team. One player. How can you have a team with one player? Obviously, you can't. However, it had a Navy V12 Marine training. So the Marines came on campus, trained to be officers, took math courses and physics courses and other courses they need to be Marine officers, and they played football. So Purdue at this time brought in players. I have the numbers here. They brought in, let's see here, where is it? Eight players from the University of Illinois, including two All-Americans, Alex Agassi and Tony Butkovich. Butkovich will later die in Okinawa. They had 5 players from Iowa, 7 players from Missouri, and so on. Even 1 player from IU, Indiana University, downstate. I like to think that he was used as sort of a mascot. You know, and maybe entered the games towards the end and, you know, did something or other. I would like to think that. I've not checked that out. And it's one of those things, you know, sometimes there's those things that you want to think are true that's best not to ask too many questions. Yeah. So anyway, I won't ask any questions about that. They go undefeated. They're fabulous. They have this great season. This team comes together. They go undefeated. They should have been national champions, but they weren't. A team that had a loss on their record, Notre Dame, was voted national champions. And there's a prejudice here. I won't go into it. But anyway, this is the way it worked. This is the way the V12 program worked. They're training officers to be to fight in the Pacific, and they're playing football at the same time. Okay, Army also wanted to get into this game. Their recruiting strategy was developed by this guy, a guy named Herman Hickman. And I wish I had more time to talk about Herman Hickman. He's an absolute character. He's kind of a big, iron beach ball type of person. He was an All-American at Tennessee. He was a professional wrestler. He had committed to memory much of the English canon of 19th century poets. He could pull off a poem at the drop of a hat. He's just a character. Please ask me more about Herman Hickman. There's great recruiting stories. His job was to recruit players from the South. Okay, who does he recruit? Some of the players that come on the team. One, Barney Poole from Gloucester, Mississippi. And there were a lot of Pools in Gloucester, Mississippi. At first, Doug Kenner, who was on the team, told me, who was also from Mississippi, said, "You got the wrong Poole. You wanted Buster Poole, not Barney Poole." Well, Barney turns out to be a hell of a player. Barney, and this kind of gives you the landscape of football at this time. Barney went after graduation from high school, if he graduated from high school, that's a question. Barney went to the Ole Miss, which is a university that you don't really have to graduate from high school to go to. No, that's a cheap shot. That's a cheap shot. I mean, they've got a good coach who I'm sure is going to be there for the next 3 or 4 days. Kiffin, those are cheap shots. I shouldn't say, I'm better than that. But Barney, here's Barney. He plays like 2 years at Mississippi. Then he's brought into West Point. Okay, the good thing for Barney going to West Point is he's going to have 3 more years to play college football because he's not going to be pulled out. The V12 programs, the players could be pulled out after when their semester was up. And their semester was not the same as an academic semester. It was I'm going into too much weeds here, but on October 31st, they could be called up and sent to Paris Island. Many were called up. As a matter of fact, the Purdue team was limited by losing its best players. Anyway, Barney could play 2 years at Mississippi. Now he's got 3 years at the academy. The academy went from 4 to 3 years then. And then with Barney, he didn't get through the academy. He got through 3 years of football at the academy. And he went back then after the war and played another couple years at Mississippi. Okay, I mean, the guy was in college, I don't know what, that's 13 years, I'm not counting. And he still didn't graduate. He was an All-American in 1944. He was an All-American, and he became an All-Pro in the pros. So he was very good. Then we have guys like DeWitt Tex Coulter. Tex came from the Masonic home, an orphanage in Texas, and they produced just a great football team, a hard-hitting, a little bit too hard-hitting sometimes, and not always legally hard-hitting. Football team. It was one of the best in the state of Texas. DeWitt was big, strong, and mean, okay? It's a sad story. His mother was around, but she said, I can't control him. Give him to Masonic home. And so, and he was a good football player. And DeWitt kind of looked at the whistle as a suggestion to stop the play, okay? If you were standing and you weren't watching, DeWitt was going to take you out. And I mean, and he took many players out, including in the Army-Navy game of 44. You know, he was, in practice, Red Blake told players, look, when the whistle blows, if DeWitt's anywhere around you, hit the ground, okay? Otherwise, you're going to hit the ground in a more unpleasant way. Okay, so we have these two. Then we have, coming from North Carolina, okay, and the United States Army, he went from North Carolina to the pre-fight program, to Army, U.S. Army, but he was found by Blake and Hickman in the Army, and he was brought in, a guy by the name of Doc Blanchard, All-American, Heisman Trophy winner, fabulous football player. Scouting report, when the Notre Dame scouted him, the Notre Dame scout wrote back, or wired back to the rest of the team, I've just seen Superman in action. He wears number 35, and he goes by the name of Blanchard. Doc Blanchard was just a tough, hard runner, fast, everything you want in a football player. And his running mate, number 41, also All-American, also Heisman Trophy winner, Glenn Davis. Glenn Davis was just special. He was, when you go into West Point, you had to take an extensive athletic test, okay? Yeah, sit-ups, push-ups, running, jumping, everything. He scored almost a perfect score in it. There wasn't a sport he couldn't play. He was extraordinarily fast. Doug Kenneth said he had just multiple gears. Nobody could catch him. If he got loose, he'd seem to be trapped, and then suddenly he'd be in the open. Somebody asked him one time, where did that speed come from? He said, God gave me that. God gave me that. Bill Yeoman, I don't know if does anybody remember the name Bill Yeomans in here? Has anybody heard of Bill Yeomans? Huh?
Houston coach.
Houston coach, absolutely. This is better than my classroom. I mentioned him in my classroom at Purdue, and I think I've woken a few people up, but no, never gotten the right answer. Anyway, Bill Yeomans played at West Point with Blanchard and Doc and Blanchard and Davis. And he said, look, there were words to describe how good Doc Blanchard was. He was fantastic, but there were words to describe it. He said there's no words to describe how good Glenn Davis was. So this is the team that they're putting together. By 1944, they've got a powerhouse. Four of the All-Americans in 1944 are going to come from West Point. And now when I'm talking about All-Americans, I'm not talking about like 22 players, All-Americans, 11 players, because players back in those rugged days went both ways. Right, Conrad? I see some heads shaking. Yeah, they went both ways. So 4 of the 11 All-Americans were on the West Point team. 3 of them are going to be on Navy's team. So in the Army-Navy game of 1944, you're going to have 7. Yeah, I was doing the math in my head. You're going to have 7 players. I was using my fingers. I didn't go to Mississippi. I went to LSU. What did Randy Newman write about LSU? Good little boys from LSU go in dumb, come out dumb too. That's an old album, very old. Anyway, big game, 1944. I mean, you have Army goes into the game in 1944, #1 in the nation. Navy goes into the game in 1944, #2 in the nation. Army undefeated, Navy had 2 losses. It was a game. Al Landy, the famous good journalist at the time, said, never before, has any sporting event, and maybe no event of any sort, of any kind, had so much attention paid to it by people all over America. This was a game, there's a big game, when America needed it, right before the bulge breaks out. America thought the war was going to be over, but it was lingering on. They wanted a taste of the home front, of a big game. In 1942, the game was played because of rationing restrictions. The game was played at Navy, an academy, at the Naval Academy. In 1943, it was played at Mikey Stadium, because nobody outside of 10 miles could go to the game because of restrictions in gas and rubber. This one is going to be played at Municipal Stadium in Baltimore. It's listened to from around the world. Soldiers in North Africa, Europe, and Asia are going to be listening to this game. It's going to be listened to by sailors on the Atlantic and the Pacific, hooked up to Armed Forces radio. I mean, the attention paid to it was just extraordinary. And it was a great game for about a half. No team had scored more than 7 points against Army that season, and Navy doesn't score it either. Navy had one great player, a guy by the name of Scott, James Scott. One of the great, all-time great nicknames. He was from Arkansas. He was from Smackover, Arkansas. So it's James Smackover Scott. That's a great. He stood up a little bit too close to Coulter during the game, and the whistle blew, and Coulter didn't exactly hear it. And Smackover Scott, who was probably faster than Glenn Davis. He was actually will come in second in the Olympic 110 high hurdles. Anyway. Army wins the game. I've gone over time. I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'll start out with a few questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. We've got some time here. First, a question I got I'll start with Randy. I'm I know in World War I, both the West Point and the Naval Academy both expanded, about almost doubled in size. But after the war, West Point shrunk, Navy didn't. So Naval Academy was always twice as big as West Point.
I cheated.
Up until the 60s.
Yeah.
Did that seem to have any impact on the quality of the competition between the two schools?
Well, certainly in the 1930s, Army was pretty pathetic. They were a bad football team. Navy was a very good football team. So I have to think that it expanded the pool. I don't know if they had the same height and weight restrictions or not, but I'm not sure if they did. But it certainly expanded the pool.
Yeah, just again, it's something you look at when you look back at the records, and again, this one of the reasons I know that is because one of the reasons I got into West Point was because it finally expanded enough where I could get in the late 60s. Okay, Brad, for you, and again, it goes back to the very first Army game I went to was 1958. And it was Army, South Carolina, and Red Blake was still a coach. It was the last year that Red Blake was still coach there. And what happened was it was a rainy day. The Army team came out, and Bill Carpenter, who was the end, he stayed away. He never came in the huddle. He always stayed. He always stayed outside. And the South Carolina coach had all these. It was raining like crazy the whole day. So the South Carolina coach is under this cover, and he's got all these notes, obviously, on scouting. And after about the first quarter, trying to figure what to do with Carpenter, who never came into the huddle, he took all his notes and threw them in the trash and just kind of sat there. The Army ran all over South Carolina. But I guess you talked about the fact that these group of Japanese Americans were very innovative in their own structures. What kind of, I mean, again, this is when he splits out an end in 1958, that's revolutionary for American football. What kind of formations is your organization doing in the fort?
It's pretty similar in that they're basically taking a lot of folks out of the backfield. They're doing a lot of trick plays, so end arounds, they're doing ladder plays, and it completely blows the minds of all of these guys from Wyoming, because they're playing high schools from Wyoming and southern Montana. And these are boys from small towns and, sort of maybe some county teams because of just how spread apart the population was in Wyoming and Montana at that point. So if I looked back through all of the records for all of the games that were played before Hart Mountain started playing too. And those games would, 6-3 sort of scores were pretty regular. And then Hart Mountain comes and is scoring 48 points a game. And not only that, but they're not giving up points. And that was the big thing that I think you can run up the score a lot, but they didn't allow a point until the final game they ever played. And a lot of that was just because they were running these other teams right off the field. They were smaller, they were thinner, they could just keep running. And these other guys just weren't used to having to do that much running. So whether you're playing a team from Powell or from Cody or from Red Lodge, Montana, these kids were used to playing in the trenches. So they had to spread out, even just to keep up with this Eagles team, it was impossible.
Back to Randy, and one of the things that, you look at the great Army teams of 44, 45, and 46, and the opposition gets better as time goes on. And the 44 team obviously is a great team with all kinds of great records, and the Army-Navy game is a great game, but what was the quality of the rest of the opposition? You mentioned that the Purdue V12 was pretty good, but I guess, again, during wartime, what kind of other teams could mount any kind of opposition to the academy?
Purdue was a V12 program. It was fantastic. Notre Dame was a V12 program. It was fantastic. But that was 43. Remember, now we're into 44. So a lot of those people in the V12 programs, we're now in Kwajalein, Tarawa. We're needing those people to go and lead commands. So the V12 program really breaks down in 44 after 43 because so many of the servicemen had gone through the 2-semester, 3-semester program they were going to go through, and now they're off to Parris Island in the Pacific.
So again, so what's the quality of opposition that the 44 team, again, a 44 team gets all this glory, but then the question is, how good is the opposition?
They're not good. I mean, it's not even competitive. For example, sometimes in the second half, they use the running clock, or they cut the half and, instead of 20 minutes, they play 10 minutes. Because the games were not even competitive. And even then, they would be, 56-0, 60-0, 60-7, what have you. And they even had, they were so good, they even used two teams. They used one team the first quarter, another team the second quarter, and then same thing in the second half.
If I could jump off that a little bit, I think one of the other advantages that the Eagles had was that, because they weren't allowed to leave camp, all of these other teams had to come play them on camp. So, you have a bunch of kids who have probably never seen a Japanese American in their life, and all of a sudden they're in a camp with 11,000 Japanese Americans, 4,000 or 5,000 of them are lining the field, and you've been told that they're the most dangerous people on earth, right? Like you're told that the reason they're in this camp is because they can't be trusted to live on their own. So these kids are coming in and are just and you're playing on a field that is dirt and rocks. And again, you've been taught that these are un-American people essentially. So for them, I often think a lot about what it must have been like for those young men to come into this situation too, which was not optimal for them either. And I think a lot about, I think a lot of the Eagles' success was the fact that you had 8 to 10 people deep literally lining the field, and it was an incredible home field advantage that it'd be difficult to replicate.
To go back, you mentioned the fact that there are some 60-some of the young men from Heart Mountain resist the draft. Mm-hmm. But that's not the only response. How about there are a lot of others that do?
For sure.
How about let's talk about numbers on the other side.
Yeah, that was that's 63 draft resistors out of a camp of 11,000 people. So the thing is, when the Army first started to try to bring Japanese Americans into the war, into the Army, they came. A few recruiters came to Heart Mountain. And they thought that everyone would immediately say oh yeah, we'll leave. They had expected to get, I think, 500-something recruits, and they walked out with 0. And the Army didn't understand it. And everyone in the camp said, look, we are loyal Americans. You're not treating us like loyal Americans, but if you do a certain number of things, if you close the camps, if you even just let our families out of the camps, we'll gladly fight for the country the only country we've ever known. We were born here, we are Americans. And so you do have a bunch of the Eagles that do end up fighting. It ends up being because of their years. They played in in the seasons of 43 and 44. And then, so you do have a bunch of those young men that do end up joining the war effort. And then you have some, like I said, at least one Eagle resisted the draft and then was imprisoned for that. And that group of draft resistors was eventually pardoned by Truman. And this player, this young man, a lot of my book is based on these oral histories that were done by Cal State students in the 70s and 80s. And I was reading through his oral history that he did, and the person who was doing it asked him, after the war and after you left and after you were pardoned, you went and joined the Army and fought in Korea. And they said, why did you do that? And he said, well, I wasn't lying when I was in camp. He's like, I'm a loyal American. I wanted to fight for my country. You didn't give me the opportunity to do that as a free man. You took that away from me and my family. But of course I'm going to fight for the only country I've ever known. And I thought that was a really powerful thing.
Okay, Randy, let's go back and talk a little bit about Blanchard and Davis. Now, it's interesting. Blanchard wins the Heisman in 45. Davis wins it in 46. Blanchard wrecks his knee in 45. He tears a tendon or something in his knee. It's a type of thing that today you'd be operated on and be out. He plays the whole 46 season with this bad knee. Again, though, the opposition is getting better, the competition is getting better, but they continue to win, except for the one tie with Notre Dame. Army-Navy 46 is interesting, though.
Yeah.
the Army-Navy game. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Well, the not going for the win.
Like, well, yeah, for Navy and then some of the things the Navy does.
Oh, I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Well, the 21-18, the 21-18 game.
Oh yeah, I didn't write about that one.
Yeah.
So
But that, yeah, just
I'm not on solid ground on that.
okay, that's okay. That's okay. It's just that the reason that the 46 team is a national champion, but it again, we go back to Notre Dame bias.
Yeah.
Yeah, Notre Dame gets some of the polls because the Army and Navy tie that year 0-0, and then the Army-Navy game is close, so some pollsters decide to go with Notre Dame, but it ends up split.
It's interesting that you talk about Blanchard hurting his knee. After they were finished with their career at Army, there was a movie made about Blanchard and Davis. And Davis was in it, and he wrecked his knee in that.
In the movie?
While
Yeah,
he was
in the
filming
movie.
the movie?
So he was never a good professional. He was, kind of a defensive back type of professional, but making the movie, he wrecked his knee.
He married a movie star or something, Davis.
Yeah,
He did. He had definitely, Davis had a pretty.
All right, so it worked out okay for him.
It did work out for him. I mean, it's interesting. Blanchard ends up as a career Air Force officer.
Yeah, he does. One of my people that I looked at in the early 40s was a guy by the name of Robin Olds.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anybody here knows Robin Olds. I'm sure everybody here knows Robin
Yeah,
Olds.
here they would.
He was a West Point. He was an All-American football player, and then he became a great pilot. He was an ace in World War II. He was an ace in Vietnam. And his best friend, they had gone through the West Point together and school to get into West Point. It was a guy by the name of Henry Romerick. And it's an interesting story that after they graduated in 44. In 43 they graduated. Yes, in 43. And so they were both overseas in 44 for D-Day. And Olds was a pilot. And so he flew the planes, fighter planes. And he was, on D-Day, he was given the job of protecting the ships from the Germans. And there really weren't any German pilots up in the air to speak of. And so he's doing nothing. He's just getting mad. He's kind of a tough guy. He's getting mad because he sees what's happening on the beaches and he can't do anything about it because he's up there. He has a mission, and his mission is just, there's nothing to fight. Olds, unbeknown to him, Romerick, who's his best friend, was an engineer. He graduated high in the academy. They became engineers, and he was on the first wave to go on to D-Day. And he was one of those boats that when it dropped the hatch, the machine gun was on. He just made it, trying to get out. As he's jumping into the water, he's hit in the chest, and he starts to sink. He starts going down. And he saw the sun gleaming off of his West Point ring. And he says, God, I'm not dying here. Not today. Not today. And so he comes up, a corpsman grabs a hold of him, pulls him ashore, puts him behind one of those defensive bunkers or defensive positions that the Germans had, and said, just stay here. I'll come back for you. And the corpsman goes off, and he was dead within 10 minutes. And so Romerick will stay there for 24 hours, looking at facing out at the sea, watching wave after wave come in. And then finally, the next day, his commanding officer sees him and says, "Are you still alive?" Yeah, good job. But those are, some West Pointer football players that certainly are in the action.
No, a lot of them are, and they're all pretty tough, too. Yeah. Okay, I think that's pretty good for my initial cut, and we've got about 15 minutes or so. Let's open for questions.
All right, we're going to start in the center aisle here.
Oh, yes, thank you. Great presentations, both of you. As far as the Heart Mountain, were any of the Japanese, and did any of them become members of the 442nd?
So none of the The Eagles did, no. There were plenty of people from Hart Mountain that became part of the 442, but none of these players. A lot of it was sort of a timing thing in terms of their age, in terms of like when they were getting drafted in, because they were a little bit younger when they started as on the team. So a lot of them sort of aged into it in 44 and 45. So a lot of it, but people would come back from the 442 to camp and talk to them about it. And that was, they were some of the biggest recruiters in the camps like Hart Mountain and Manzanar were folks from the 442. And, if you looked through the newspaper accounts, because Hart Mountain in particular had sort of an exceptional, professionally done newspaper in the camp, because they had a man who was incarcerated there that worked at the Seattle Times, and a lot of the newspaper was used as a tool for recruitment for the 442. They talked a lot about the 442's heroics throughout that.
We're going to stay on the same row, please.
FDR was known for as a progressive president, Social Security, lots of other programs to benefit people. Why did he ignore the advice of J. Edgar Hoover and others and sign 9066? Does anybody? That seems like it was very queer for him to do that because of his progressive kind of attitudes during the Great Depression. Didn't make any sense to me.
No, I think that, looking back in hindsight, it doesn't make sense, I think, through our sort of modern lens of FDR and even in the moment. But I think that there was also, a lot of it was that FDR was just sort of distracted by Europe. And I think that there were a lot of things that he sort of gave others authority to do, especially on the home front, that he was really just had his eyes on the actual war that was going on as opposed to at home. And, there's I went back through the historic record, and Roosevelt is very much more of, pro-China than he is Japan. So, like, his views on China and Japan also sort of clouded his vision, I think, a little bit on that. And, eventually he just said, okay, if it has to be done, do it as humanely as possible. And, but he was a politician. And I think that he knew that this is what the country was starting to ask for. And you also look at, in 44, there was never really a military necessity for this incarceration. But by the end of 43 and the beginning of 44, there was absolutely none. And everyone in his cabinet was saying, hey, we should close the camps. There's no reason to keep the camps open. And he said, well, we can't close the camps in an election year. So the camps were closed pretty much almost a month after the November 44 election when he was reelected. So,
And again, one of the ironies is nothing was done to the Japanese Americans in Hawaii.
right, yeah, that's the big thing that I think most people think. That's a great point. In that, it was so selective that you could live in Eastern Washington or Eastern Oregon and not be incarcerated. It was only if you were within a certain zone on the West Coast. And yeah, where Pearl Harbor occurred, those Japanese Americans were, allowed to still have their lives because the military commander over Hawaii and Alaska recognized that if you took Japanese Americans out of Hawaii, the entire economy would collapse.
Yeah.
So and that was, so it just shows how unnecessary incarceration was in general.
Next questions in the front row to your left, please.
Dr. Roberts, there's a similar story to one you were telling me by a fellow in Dallas named Bob Folsom. And Folsom was a good player from Dallas, Texas, of influential family. And Red Blank courted him and got him to go to West Point and got him a deferment, of course. And he played there 2 years on the 44-45 team. And then he came back and played for SMU, and he was an All-American end at SMU. And he played with Doak Walker, Kyle Rote, and that group of players. But he was the same thing. But he wasn't of the talent or the maturity of a Davis or a Blanchard that he could actually play first string for Army. But he played 2 years there.
Yeah, a lot of the players were in college, had played someplace else, and then Hickman went in and recruited them and got them out of the Army or out of the other school, and they entered West Point, in which gave them 3 more years of eligibility.
So when he played 6 years of college football like this fella.
Yeah. Well, although they're doing it again now, they're playing it 6 or 7 years with the portal system.
I saw an article yesterday about some quarterback who was ready to play his 7th year.
Yeah.
So we've returned to the era of World War II.
They're getting paid well, too.
We're going to stay to your left with Connie, towards the front, please.
Just so you know, Barney Poole was an uncle. No, I'm only kidding. Couple of comments and a question. It's hard to overestimate the strength of the Army team. They beat Notre Dame 48-0, 59-0 in 44-45, and then the 46 game 0-0. Blanchard breaks away and gets tackled by Johnny Lujak, or else Army wins the game. But just a couple of questions, or another comment. Ironically, the offensive coordinator in the early 50s for Red Blake, do you know who that was?
The
Offensive coordinator? Vince Lombardi.
Lombardi, yeah.
Yeah, Lombardi really learned how to coach football under Red Blake. But my question is, did they relax the standards in terms of admission? I know Doc Blanchard's finished in the bottom 5% of the class. Any comments?
Yeah, there's no question. A couple comments. The first one you said was, I'm trying to remember. The first part of your...
The dominance over Notre Dame, and then that one.
Well, in terms of the standards, they definitely relaxed the standards. One of the things to build a great football team, they felt, is everybody had to be aboard, okay? From the superintendent to the football coach, down to the trainer, everybody had to be on board. And so they went out and recruited football players, okay? Not people that are going to be great cadets. And this is still controversial at West Point today, because a lot of these players they recruited only stayed for a couple years. And then when the war was over, they either quit school or flunked out. And so, Tex Coulter and Barney Poole among them. Some of the West Pointers feel like, they were taking up slots that should have gone to people that were going to stay in the service. Of the group, I think Conrad mentioned Blanchard was the one that stayed in and retired as a colonel, I think.
Yep, he did.
Retired as a colonel. But yeah, it was interesting. I remember what I was going to say. In terms of Blake, he was such a perfectionist. Okay, he pioneered the uses of film. And with Lombardi, he said one time, he said, "Hey, Vince, let's do," it was a hot summer day, "let's do something fun today." And Lombardi's thinking, "Oh, good, we're going to play golf or something. Let's go up to my office and watch some film." Okay, and his office was on top of the athletic building, and it was just hot as hell in there. And but this is where Blake saw his son play. Bob Blake was a very good quarterback. He saw his son play in high school, 1/2 of 1 quarter, and he watched it from behind some hedges and then left. That's all the time he had. He didn't even have time to go watch his son play. He was just obsessed with football.
Didn't his son get embroiled in a scandal?
Yeah.
Was his son embroiled in a scandal?
Yeah.
What happens is that Blake, after 46, the 47 team loses to Columbia, which breaks the string, and then they lose to Notre Dame. But by the late 40s, you get to 1950, and Army is a powerhouse again. And then it's in late 50, in 51, you have the cheating scandal, which is basically it was a toleration problem. And Blake's son is one of the ones who gets kicked out because he knew somebody who had cheated, but the Army, again, the honor code is, I will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. So most of the football players that got expelled, which was most of the team, were for toleration because they knew some guys, but they didn't want to turn them in. And so it took a few years for the team to rebuild again, but Blake does it again. But it is, yeah, it's a tragedy with what happens in the late 50s.
And Doug Kenna, who played for Blake, he was a quarterback, and he's from Mississippi also. And he was a great guy, but he was the head tutor for this. And I don't think Kenna knew anything about it, but Blake said afterwards, you'll never get a big job. So Kenna went into private business, did very well.
All right, we're going to stay in the front center, please.
I had the pleasure of seeing Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside play football in 1946 when my dad took me up to West Point to the game. I wanted to talk about Bill Carpenter. You mentioned him. I think he was tragically killed in Vietnam, was he not?
No, he actually got he basically was decorated for bringing calling shelling in on his own unit in Vietnam. Eventually, he retired like a 2-star general. He was not killed, though. He was decorated in Vietnam for he called artillery rounds in on his unit on himself to save his unit.
We're going to go to the front again, to your right, gentlemen.
This one's for Randy, about the Purdue V12 team.
Yes.
And the Hoosier mascot.
Yeah.
So IU is undefeated and #2 in the nation right now. How's Purdue doing? And any prediction on the Oak and Bucket game next week?
They have yet to play the Boilermakers, who haven't won a conference game in 2 years. And so we're due. We're due. And by the way, I meant to cast no aspersion on Mississippi, just as a rivalry and LSU. It's a very fine institution. My prediction is, to quote one of the Rocky movies, pain.
We have time for one last question. It's going to be all the way to your right, halfway back here, gentlemen.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I like having the opportunity to get clarity about something. I read a book this last year that was called Mosquito Bowl by a guy named Buzz Bissinger. And I don't know if those of you are familiar with it, but basically it was a story of football players that were deployed with the Marine Corps and the Navy in the Solomon Islands, and they were after the Battle of Guadalcanal waiting for their next deployment, and they decided to play football, and they played football on coral fields and had a lot of real quality players. But this guy that wrote the book did a lot of talking about the same kinds of things you did, players getting recruited on the V programs at various colleges and how that changed their performance. And he implies at the end, rather significantly, that he felt that a lot of people opted to go to the Air Force or to the Naval Academy in West Point to get out of having to serve overseas in combat positions in the military, that they could go to West Point, go to Navy, and be assured of staying there for 3 or 4 years when likely the war would be over. And it was kind of painful to read that, and I've never heard that before, but do you have a thought about that?
Well, yeah, I have. And, I don't know the human heart. These people are not around anymore. Blake, part of what Blake says is you want to be an officer, okay, an effective officer, come to West Point. You're going to have 3 years of training and you will be an effective officer at the end. They didn't know when the war was going to be over. We didn't know the war was going to be over in 1945. Soldiers had expressions, home alive in 45, back in the sticks in 46, Golden Gate in 48, back in, we didn't know if it was going to be, so there's a little bit of, well, it ended in 45, so they're trying to get out of it. Were some? Maybe, probably. Were others? Probably not. But again, I hate to evaluate the human heart of a person I don't know.
I'm going to take floor MC's prerogative. Brad, we know that the Army, Navy, the academies, they have reunions every year. Were there reunions for any of the Heart Mountain teams?
So Heart Mountain to this day has a major reunion every year in July at the camp. And that's actually where I was able to do a lot of my research and find players and their families. That in 2017, I started going to all the reunions and finding players and finding their families to be able to report this out. So they don't necessarily have team reunions, but also what happened was when the war ended, the majority of the folks that were at Heart Mountain were originally from the Los Angeles area, and then everybody else that wasn't, most of them also moved to Los Angeles. So you had Eagles that were just became friends in camp and then all moved to the same neighborhood, all moved to the same apartment buildings afterwards. So I have some photos in the book of 4 or 5 of the Eagles just sitting on the stoop of an apartment building that they all lived in together in 46, 47, 48 in that time frame. So it was obviously like a terrible time, but there were these moments, these friendships that came together in the camp specifically that really extended into mid-century. And there were the 2 main characters in my book, Babe Nomura and Horst Yoshinaga, met in camp. Horst was a farm kid from Mountain View. He had never been to a city before in his life, and they became best friends in camp. George moved to Los Angeles, and they spent the rest of their life as best friends.
He's got some really interesting pictures in his book that you track down.
Yeah, yeah, I do.
Round of applause for our wonderful panel. Thank you, gentlemen. They will all be outside signing copies of their books. Please be back for 4 o'clock. Also, you may want to take the opportunity to sign up for the early bird discount for the 2026 International Conference, and you will be able to save money and secure your seat. Thank you. See you back at 4 o'clock.